A plastic ice cube tray sits on a kitchen counter. Inside each cube, instead of water, there is egg, frozen solid, pale yellow, perfectly sealed. Pull one out 3 months later. Let it thaw overnight in the refrigerator. Crack it into a pan the next morning, and it scrambles like it was bought yesterday. Most people think that is impossible. Most people think an egg only has a week, maybe 2, before it needs to go in the trash. They watch the carton in the refrigerator door, they check the date stamped on the side, and when that date passes, the egg goes in the garbage, whether it was still good or not. That habit costs money every single week. It has for decades, and almost nobody stops to ask why it has to work that way. In Amish households, food does not get a countdown clock. It gets a system, a plan for where it goes before it has the chance to spoil. That is the part most modern kitchens never learned, and it is the part this video is built around. Here is the promise. By the end of this, you will understand a method that lets a dozen store-bought eggs, the kind sitting in your refrigerator right now, last for months instead of days. Not by magic. Not by some forgotten mystical trick. By a plain, testable process that Amish kitchens have leaned on for generations, built around batching, cold storage, and a small amount of prep most people skip. This is not about eggs straight from a farm, with the shell still coated in its natural protective layer. This is about the eggs from the grocery store, the washed ones, the ones in the carton with the sell-by date. Those eggs behave differently, and by the end of this video, you will know exactly why and exactly what to do about it. Start with the frustration, because almost everyone watching this has lived it. You buy a dozen eggs, you use 6 for breakfast over the week. Life gets busy. The other 6 sit in the door of the refrigerator, and 2 weeks later, you crack one open just to check, and it smells wrong, or the yolk looks thin and flat, and it goes down the drain. Multiply that by every month, every year, and it adds up to a real amount of wasted food and wasted money. It rarely feels like a big loss in the moment. It is 1 egg, maybe 2, every couple of weeks. But add up a year of small losses like that, next to a year of rising grocery prices, and the total is not small at all. It is the kind of quiet waste that never shows up on a receipt, because it happens after the receipt, in the refrigerator, out of sight. The grocery store sold you the dozen. It did not sell you a system for using it. That is the gap Amish households have historically filled, not with a special ingredient, but with a habit. In Amish kitchens, food is not left to wait around with no destination. Everything that comes into the house has a plan attached to it, whether that is today's dinner, this week's bread, or next winter's pantry. Think about how differently that plays out in most modern homes. The refrigerator becomes a holding cell instead of a working part of the kitchen. Food goes in with good intentions and comes out weeks later, either forgotten or spoiled, and the cycle repeats the next time the cart rolls through the store. It is not laziness. It is simply that nobody ever handed most people a working alternative. The habit of processing food the same week it arrives, instead of hoping it survives until it is needed, is not common knowledge anymore. It used to be. In many Amish households, it still is. That habit shows up clearly on what many Amish families still think of as processing day. It is not a formal event with a name written on a calendar. It is simply the pattern many Amish households fall into, especially when eggs, produce, or dairy come in faster than they can be used fresh. Instead of letting extra food sit and gamble on spoilage, it gets moved, right then, into a form that will hold. For eggs, in a washed, store-bought state, that form is the freezer. This is a household with more people to feed than most modern kitchens plan for, and often fewer trips to town to restock in between. A large family cannot run on the assumption that a quick errand will fix a shortage tomorrow. Food gets handled with that reality in mind, and eggs are treated the same way flour, milk, and garden produce are treated. The moment there is more on hand than will be used in the next day or two, the question is not, will this still be good next week? It is, what does this need right now to make sure it still is? This is where most people get stuck, because the first instinct is wrong, and it is worth naming that mistake clearly. You cannot freeze an egg in its shell. The water inside the egg expands as it freezes, and the shell has nowhere to send that pressure. It cracks. Sometimes it splits wide open in the freezer, and you are left cleaning up a mess and wasting the egg anyway. So the shell has to come off first. That is the first thing Amish-style batch processing does differently. The egg is cracked, checked, and separated from the shell before it ever goes near the cold. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but skipping this step is the reason most people who try to freeze eggs on their own give up after one bad experience. The second part is smaller than most beginners expect, and it is also the part almost nobody knows about, even people who have tried freezing eggs before. If you freeze a raw egg yolk with nothing added to it, something strange happens to the texture. The proteins in the yolk clump together as ice crystals form, and when it thaws, instead of a smooth, pourable yolk, you get something thick, almost rubbery, closer to gel than liquid. It will not mix into batter properly. It will not blend into a smooth scramble. Bakers who have run into this problem for years have a name for it: yolk gelation. It is not spoilage. It is not unsafe. It is simply a texture problem, and it has a simple fix. That fix is a small amount of salt or sugar mixed into the eggs before freezing. Depending on the source, the ratio is roughly half a teaspoon of salt, or about a tablespoon and a half of sugar for every cup of whole eggs, which is close to 4 or 5 large eggs. Salt for eggs headed toward savory cooking. Sugar for eggs headed toward baking. That one small addition is what keeps the texture workable after thawing. Egg whites on their own do not need this step. They freeze and thaw just fine without any additive, keeping their ability to whip and foam. It helps to understand, in plain terms, what is actually happening inside that yolk. A raw yolk is packed with proteins suspended in fat and water. When it freezes slowly, ice crystals form and push those proteins closer together, and the proteins bond to each other in a way they cannot easily undo once thawed. Salt and sugar interrupt that bonding. They do not stop the ice from forming, but they slow down how tightly those proteins clump, and that is the difference between a smooth yolk and a rubbery one after thawing. It is a small amount of chemistry, but it solves a problem that has ended a lot of people's attempts at freezing eggs before this video ever reached them. This is the part of the story that belongs to a broader tradition of old-fashioned batch food preservation, not something unique only to Amish households. But it fits naturally inside Amish pantry logic, because the underlying idea is the same one that shows up everywhere in an Amish kitchen. Never let food sit unused when it can be moved into a stable form instead. Here is what that actually looks like, step by step, the way many Amish households have approached it for batches of eggs at a time. None of it requires anything unusual. It is closer to an assembly line than a recipe, and once it is done a few times, it stops feeling like extra work at all. The first thing is cracking each egg into a separate small bowl before adding it to the larger batch. This is not extra work for the sake of tradition. It is a check. If one egg has gone bad, it ruins that one small bowl, not the entire batch you are about to freeze. Skipping this step is the modern mistake that ends with an entire batch thrown out over one bad egg. The second thing is adding the salt or sugar, depending on what the eggs will be used for later, and mixing gently, not whisking hard enough to work in air, just enough to blend the yolk, white, and additive into one smooth mixture. The third thing is straining that mixture through a fine mesh sieve. This breaks up the thick strands in the egg white and makes sure everything freezes and thaws evenly, without lumps. The fourth thing is pouring the mixture into small portions, ice cube trays, silicone muffin cups, or small rigid containers, leaving a small gap at the top. That gap matters. Liquid expands as it freezes, and a container filled all the way to the rim can crack or pop its lid. The fifth thing is labeling the container with the date it was frozen and what it was mixed with, salt or sugar. This sounds obvious, but it is the step almost everyone skips, and it is the reason people end up guessing months later whether a batch was meant for eggs and bacon or for a batch of muffins. A strip of masking tape and a pencil is all it takes, and it is exactly the kind of small, unglamorous habit that shows up throughout an Amish pantry, on jars of preserves, on bags of dried beans, on anything meant to sit in storage until it is needed. The sixth thing is keeping the freezer at a steady, cold temperature and leaving the eggs there until they are needed. At that steady cold, the eggs will hold for close to a year. The seventh thing, and the one most beginners get wrong, is how the eggs come back out. They are never thawed on the counter. They come out of the freezer and go into the refrigerator, slowly, over roughly half a day to a full day, and once thawed, they are cooked within about 24 hours, not left in the refrigerator for another week. Used. That order matters, and it leads directly into the part of this video that has to be said plainly, without exaggeration in either direction. Store-bought eggs are not the same as farm eggs with an intact shell. When an egg is laid, it comes out coated in a natural, nearly invisible layer that seals the thousands of tiny pores in the shell. That coating blocks moisture loss and blocks bacteria from working their way inside. Commercial processing in the United States washes that coating off, along with a lot of surface bacteria, which is why store eggs are required to be kept cold from the moment they are processed. Once that coating is gone, the shell is porous, and without refrigeration, that egg is far more vulnerable, not less. This matters because there are old preservation methods that genuinely worked for generations on farm-fresh, unwashed eggs, sitting on the shelf at room temperature for months. Submerging eggs in a solution of hydrated lime is one of them. It is a real, historical method, and it worked because it relied on that natural coating still being intact, plus a chemical reaction that sealed the pores from the outside as well. As the lime reacts with carbon dioxide in the water, it slowly forms a mineral layer of calcium carbonate directly over the shell, closing off the pores from the outside in. On a farm-fresh egg with its natural coating still intact, that outside seal works alongside the coating the hen already provided, and the two together can hold an egg for months without any cold at all. Apply that same method to a washed, store-bought egg, and it does the opposite of what it is supposed to do. Without the natural seal, the alkaline solution gets inside the egg itself, breaking down the proteins and ruining both the taste and the texture. It is not a shortcut for a modern carton of eggs. It is a mismatch, and it is worth saying plainly here, because it is exactly the kind of old trick that circulates online without anyone mentioning that it depends entirely on a coating a grocery store egg no longer has. The same caution applies to coating eggs in mineral oil, another old method, and a real one. A thin layer of food-grade mineral oil can seal the pores of a shell almost as effectively as the egg's own natural coating, and this does work on store-bought eggs, but only with one condition attached. It has to be paired with steady refrigeration, not room temperature storage. Sealing the pores without cold removes one of the safeguards that refrigeration normally provides, and food safety researchers do not recommend relying on an oil seal alone at room temperature. Combine the oil coating with a refrigerator running at a steady, cold temperature, and the shelf life on that carton stretches out to roughly 2 to 3 months longer than an untreated egg. Skip the refrigeration, and it is not a safe shortcut, no matter how the method is dressed up online. For anyone curious how that method actually gets applied, it is straightforward, but it only makes sense as a companion to the refrigerator, not a replacement for it. A small amount of food-grade mineral oil, the kind sold for exactly this purpose, gets wiped over the entire surface of a clean, dry shell. Then the eggs go straight into the coldest, steadiest part of the refrigerator. It buys extra time on eggs that are going to be used whole, still in the shell, rather than cracked and frozen. It is a second tool in the same toolbox, not a competing claim about surviving without cold altogether. That is the honest, unglamorous truth sitting underneath a lot of Amish trick claims floating around. There is no version of a modern, washed grocery store egg that is safe, sitting untouched on a countertop for months. What Amish households actually rely on is not a workaround for that fact. It is a full acceptance of it, paired with a system that removes the guesswork. Freeze it properly, or keep it cold and sealed properly. Either one, done right, turns a short shelf life into a long one. Neither one pretends the cold does not matter. This is also where the difference between a recipe and a system becomes clear. A recipe tells you what to do with eggs once. A system tells you what to do with every dozen that comes through the door, every single time, without having to think about it fresh each week. That is what shows up across an Amish pantry as a whole, not just with eggs. Flour gets checked and stored to avoid pests and moisture. A bread starter gets fed on a schedule that keeps it alive without daily fuss. Far less feeding than most beginners assume is required, just enough to keep it going between bakes. Root vegetables get layered into sand or sawdust in a cellar, not because it looks rustic, but because it slows down spoilage without a single dollar of electricity. Eggs fit into that same pattern. The goal in each case is not intensity. It is not spending hours in the kitchen every day. It is a small amount of consistent effort that removes the need to gamble on whether food is still good. That is precisely why low waste fits so naturally into Amish food culture. A large household, often feeding many people from one kitchen, cannot afford for a dozen eggs to become garbage because nobody got around to using them in time. Every ingredient that comes into the house is treated as something with a job to do, and the kitchen's habits are built around making sure that job gets done before spoilage can take it away. It is not about scarcity for its own sake. It is about respecting the work and the animals and the money that went into producing that food in the first place. That respect shows up in small, unglamorous ways that rarely make it into a headline. A cracked egg does not get poured down the drain just because the shell looked a little different. A slightly older loaf of bread does not get thrown away. It gets turned into something else, dried, toasted, worked back into another meal. The same instinct applies to eggs sitting near the edge of their usable window. Nothing gets discarded on a guess. Everything gets checked, and if it is still good, it gets used or preserved, not gambled with and lost. Set that against the modern habit of buying a fresh dozen every single week, sometimes with older eggs still sitting untouched in the door, and the contrast becomes obvious. It is not that anyone is doing anything wrong on purpose. It is that almost nobody was ever taught the alternative. The grocery store sells the carton. It does not sell the habit that keeps that carton from going to waste. Now put a number on that gap, because the difference is not just about waste. It is about cost, too. Egg prices have traditionally swung with the seasons, generally lower in spring and summer, when hens naturally lay more, and higher around the winter holidays, though in recent years shortages and disease outbreaks have caused much bigger swings on top of that pattern. Buying in bulk during a lower price stretch and processing that bulk into frozen, ready-to-use portions means paying the lower seasonal price for eggs that get used across the higher-priced months instead. Add in the eggs that used to be thrown away simply because they sat too long unused, and the two savings stack together. It is not a dramatic overnight windfall. It is a slow, steady difference that shows up over months, the same way most Amish household economics work. Small, consistent choices, repeated, rather than one big dramatic change. Picture two households buying the exact same amount of eggs over a year. One buys a dozen every week, at whatever price the store happens to be charging that week, including the higher winter prices, and loses a few eggs here and there to spoilage along the way. The other buys in larger batches when prices are lower, processes that batch the same day it comes home, and draws from the freezer through the months when store prices climb. Over the course of a year, that second household is not spending more time in the kitchen overall. The time simply moves. A small block of processing time up front replaces a slow trickle of waste and higher prices later. That is the actual trade being made, and it is the same trade Amish households have been making with eggs, produce, and dairy for a very long time. None of this requires special equipment: a bowl, a fine mesh strainer, an ice cube tray or small containers, and a working freezer. That is the entire list. No fermentation crock, no cellar, no specialty tools. Just the willingness to spend 15 or 20 minutes on a batch of eggs before they have the chance to sit around and spoil. To bring it back to where this started, a plastic tray of frozen egg cubes on a counter is not a trick. It is not a secret the grocery store is hiding from anyone. It is the plain result of a habit that many Amish households never stopped practicing. A habit built on batching, on labeling, on cold storage done properly, and on using food before it has the chance to go to waste. Store-bought eggs will never behave exactly like eggs straight from a farm, and pretending otherwise is how people end up with a spoiled dozen and a bad experience. But treated the right way, cracked, mixed with a small amount of salt or sugar, strained, portioned, labeled, and frozen properly, that same carton of grocery store eggs can quietly outlast almost anyone's expectations. That is the part worth sitting with. A kitchen habit does not need to be complicated to work. It just needs to be followed consistently, the same way it has been followed in Amish households for a long time, long before anyone thought to put a label like "trick" on it. The old way was not complicated. It was just consistent, and consistency is the part modern kitchens tend to lose first, buried under convenience packaging and countdown dates that treat every carton the same, whether it is truly close to spoiling or perfectly fine. That is the difference between a recipe and a system, and it is worth repeating because it applies far beyond eggs. A recipe answers one meal. A system answers every week, without needing to be reinvented each time. Amish kitchens have leaned on that difference for a long time, not because it is old-fashioned for its own sake, but because it simply works, meal after meal, season after season. If you are the kind of person who hates watching food go to waste, who remembers someone in your family who never let anything sit around and spoil, this kind of system is probably going to make sense to you immediately. It is not a lifestyle change. It is 15 minutes, once, with a bowl and a strainer, standing between a dozen eggs, and months of use instead of days. Did your mother or grandmother keep a bread starter, a crock, a pantry jar, or a food habit that nobody in the house was allowed to throw away? Leave that memory in the comments. Those stories are part of why this channel exists in the first place, and they tend to remind other people watching of habits their own families let go of somewhere along the way. If this is the kind of practical, old-fashioned system you want to keep learning, subscribe, because there is a lot more of this coming, straight from the way Amish kitchens have always handled food, one small, unglamorous habit at a time.